The control we used solved a number of the problems we thought we were going to have when embarking on this application. But the fact that the UI kind of impacted how we designed our domain begs the question about, well, if you're totally focused on the domain, why would you even be thinking about the UI? But thinking about the UI while we're working on the domain is not the anti-pattern you may think it is.
Yes, we've been focusing on the domain, but frequently the user interface needs to be considered, especially in the early stages of planning. You don't want to try to flesh out the whole domain design before you start thinking about the UI.
In a TechEd session I attended in 2013, Jimmy Nilsson, who's the author of the book Applying Domain-Driven Design and Patterns, talked about the importance of thinking about the UI in the early stages of planning and revisiting it while modeling the domain rather than ignoring it until the end. In his session, he describes how even the UI sketching he does in the early stages of his application planning can affect the whole design of the system. As we were building the scheduler sample for this course, we actually discovered a huge benefit to considering the UI early in the process. We initially had expected to encounter a lot of complexity in the appointment scheduling problem, but we found a UI control that helped visualize the schedule for the user such that the system no longer needed to be as complex. In our scenario, scheduling is a big part of the application, but it isn't our domain. Our domain is the veterinary clinic. We consider scheduling to be more of a cross-cutting concern and one that could be partially solved through a rich user interface.
By considering and using a rich user interface, we were able to do things like allowing conflicting appointments while making it obvious to the user that this had occurred. This gives the user more information, and they can make decisions about whether or not they need to correct the problem. When we initially considered the problem of appointment conflicts, we had thought the domain model would throw exceptions anytime something like that occurred, but this would have resulted in a much worse user experience. Frequently, in domain-driven design, you need to consider the user experience, which at times may need to allow for models that are, at least temporarily, in an invalid or incomplete state. Keep this in mind as you design your domain model, and be careful not to make it too rigid to support scenarios your users may benefit from.
Thinking about the UI up front and discovering this kind of solution kept us from wasting a lot of time trying to solve certain scheduling problems in our domain. Of course, you don't want your UI to totally drive how you model your domain, but as Jimmy Nilsson notes, you shouldn't ignore it either. When you're developing apps using DDD, it can be helpful to visualize how processes communicate both within a bounded context and between contexts as part of a business process. As we mentioned earlier in this course, Alberto Brandolini has done a lot of work on a related practice called event storming. Event storming can be used by all parts of a business, not just developers, to describe how a part of the business works and to make the whole thing visible. Once this is done, later iterations of the diagrams and artifacts produced can be useful for modeling the software that will be used by the business.
You might recall the image we showed earlier of Julie facilitating an event storming workshop with a client. The result of that first iteration, called chaotic discovery, is not so easily captured, but it provides guidance for the later modeling you might do.
There are many ways to model your system. Another method, event modeling, championed by Adam Dimitruk, is another process, and this focuses on the inputs and outputs of events and how each of those events changes the system and changes state. And you can describe an entire system with this flow.
We've used the wonderful online tool called a Miro board at Miro.com to show one perspective of the scheduling system as information flows through the front desk application and into the vet clinic public website bounded context. The colors used here correspond to different things in our model, like aggregates, events, and other processes.
And there are other modeling processes that have been invented, adopted, and adapted within the DDD community. And many of us rely on a combination of processes and tools to help us and help our clients better understand their systems before embarking on design. But as always, balance is important. You'll want to beware of analysis paralysis.
Definitely. That reminds me of something Eric Evans talked to us about.
Steve and I believe that it would be fitting to leave you with one last thought from the father of domain-driven design, Eric Evans. Eric was kind enough to talk to us about DDD when we originally created this course so that we could share with you some of his wisdom. Eric talked about the fallacy of perfectionism, which aligns with our own sentiments about considering what you've learned here to be guidance to help you solve complex software problems, not a roadblock to productivity.
Eric shared with us that what he's noticed is that there seems to be something about DDD that brings out the perfectionist in people. They say, this model's not really good enough, and churn, trying to improve it. He says, no model is ever going to be perfect.
Eric goes on to say that we need to know what we're doing with this thing, the scenarios we're trying to address. We want a model that helps us do that makes it easier to make software that solves those problems. That's it.
This reminds me of the saying, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Our domain models don't need to be perfect. They just need to help us build the software that helps people solve problems and get work done. Don't strive for a perfect model, but rather just aim to develop a useful one.
Julie and I wanted to finish this course by spending a couple of minutes talking about some of the things we've learned since we published the first edition of the course in 2014.
We've received a ton of positive feedback from so many of you over the last few years, and we really appreciate it. So we did our best not to change the overall flow of this course too much, since we know the last one was so well received.
Definitely. If you watched the original version, hopefully you found this one to be fresh but familiar, and I suspect a lot of students will end up watching both as a way to cement some of these concepts, or just to spend more time with us, right, Julie?
Maybe. Now, let's highlight some of the things that have changed in the last few years. From a strict DDD perspective, there are a lot of new resources and techniques that have emerged as more and more companies are adopting DDD. Things like event storming and event modeling, which we've touched on in this course, are starting to become mainstream parts of DDD for many organizations.
Yes, and the industry's use of some patterns has shifted too. There's a lot of pushback against the repository pattern these days, I think in part because it became very popular, but was often used without the context of DDD or other complementary patterns, like the specification, and these can really help it shine. Our first course didn't really talk much about specification as a core DDD pattern, but it's something I use on most of my projects now.
From a technology perspective, our previous course was built for .NET developers, and at the same time, that meant .NET 4. The original veterinary application used ASP.NET MVC and Web API and an early version of SignalR. And for data access, we used Entity Framework 6.
Since then, .NET Core, which is now .NET 5, has shipped and become the new standard for .NET developers, and the latest versions of EF Core have added a number of features that we're leveraging to help improve the design of our model, like owned objects and filtered includes. We also shifted our use of domain events from being pre-persistence to post-persistence. There are valid use cases for both kinds of domain events, but the latter is safer for any events that communicate outside of the domain, so we're defaulting to that this time around.
Right, especially since one of our key demos involves sending emails to the client. The original sample also used SQL Server for its message broker, which we chose because we didn't want to force our students to have to install a custom tool. But Docker is another technology that wasn't mainstream in 2014, but it is today, and it makes it a breeze to use custom bits of infrastructure. In this update to the course, we're definitely leveraging Docker to provide RabbitMQ messaging with zero install, as well as to capture emails during development using Papercut in another Docker container.
Yeah, Docker should really make it trivial for students to run the application locally, even though it has a bunch of moving parts. If you don't have Docker, you can still run it in your IDE or from the command line, but with Docker it's just a lot simpler to get going.
And along with Docker and containers, microservices have become a huge buzzword in the industry. Of course, Docker makes it much easier to deploy microservices, and DDD principles really shine when designing them. So all of these things, I think, are really complementary.
Definitely. Although I do think some companies are too quick to jump to microservices without fully understanding their domain and where to separate out different contexts. And on the topic of separation, our previous sample put everything in one giant solution too, mostly to make it easier to find things.
This time, we went with something that should resemble a real-world application even more, with separate solutions for each bounded context. We even published the shared kernel as a NuGet package, in our case hosted on nuget.org, although typically your organization would probably have a private NuGet feed.
If you're still working with .NET Framework apps and you haven't watched the previous course, we encourage you to give it a look. Its samples are geared more toward that framework, and you should find a link to it on Julie or my author page here on Pluralsight or at this bit.ly link here.
And don't feel bad if it feels like there's still a lot you have to learn about DDD. It's a big topic, and as we've just shared, Steve and I are constantly learning new ways to apply it too. Be sure to check out other DDD courses here on Pluralsight, and if you need direct help for you or your team, you can reach out to Steve or me directly. If you remember nothing else from this particular module, the one thing to keep in mind is how simple it was for us to add in what was potentially a really complicated feature. Because of our DDD implementation and some of the infrastructure we had already built, it wasn't really very challenging to plug these new puzzle pieces into the application.
Right. We introduced a couple of new concepts. We talked about message queues, and those fit really nicely into our existing architecture because we were already using events to correspond to interesting things happening within our application.
And the message queue allowed us to stick a message in an external place by one application, and another application can come along and retrieve that message. So the message queue allows our applications to communicate with each other, but they can do it in a disconnected way.
And then we mentioned, but we didn't show, this concept of a service bus, often called an enterprise service bus, which you may want to introduce if you start having more than just a couple applications needing to talk to one another.
At the risk of being redundant, let's just pay homage one more time to how the decisions we made earlier on when implementing the Vet Clinic solution allowed us to add in a potentially complicated new feature, email notifications and responses, into the application.
While we had used Mediator to transfer domain events within the front desk application, this time we took advantage of message queues to help us move events back and forth between applications.
Using RabbitMQ's API, we created 3 different queues that were specific to the cross-application communications we needed. For example, a queue that the Vet Clinic public app could publish messages into for the front desk application to retrieve so it could update the UI.
It's also important to note that we leveraged existing tools like RabbitMQ and Papercut to perform certain tasks. In DDD, we would refer to these as generic domains. You gotta look under the covers to see how the code was making all the communication between the apps and the message queues possible, but without our domain model having to know about any of the details.
And then we shared some additional knowledge as we wrapped up the course. We talked about modeling practices like event storming and tools like Miro. We talked about all of the new ideas that have evolved since we first published this course in 2014 and how they impacted this new version of the course and the sample application.
And we ended with some more wisdom from Eric Evans, to whom we are eternally grateful not only for bringing DDD to the software community, but also for spending time with us when we created the original course so that we could share his perspective and insights with you.
Like the end of a fireworks display, when they shoot up many fireworks at once, we're sharing here a lot of resources and links because of the great many topics we brought into this last module. There are 2 pages of links here to articles and videos and other Pluralsight courses, so you might want to pause the video to be sure that you see them all.
So, from me, Steve Smith,
And from me, Julie Lerman, thanks so much for taking this journey with us through domain-driven design fundamentals.